Everybody. I'm David Suissa, publisher, editor in chief of the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles. And this session today has a very special place in my heart. One of the highlights of my life was visiting the South during Martin Luther King Day weekend with my daughter, my high school daughter. It was organized by a synagogue in Washington, D.C. And it was 3 days. We were in Montgomery and Selma that I will never forget. So we have a really fascinating conversation planned for today. Before I introduce our panelist, I'd like to refer you to a video, some words from Senator Cory Booker.
Hi, everyone. It's Cory Booker. I am so excited about the Black Jewish Entertainment Alliance. It is, to me, urgent. I know what the role artists have played in transforming the moral imagination of this country and compelling us to deeper and greater justice. I also know of the power of the Black Jewish Alliance in America in calling to the conscience of this country and helping us to better make manifest the ideals that we say, liberty and justice for all, but still are falling so far short of. I live in Newark, New Jersey. Around the corner from me is a Black church that used to be a synagogue that was led by a man named Johann Prince, expelled by the Nazis, and came to America and started fighting for the cause to fight the Nazis, raising money, saw the conditions of Black Americans, and lived this Jewish ideal. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, then when? Those words of Hillel compelled him to be a great civil rights activist. He was one of the 5 people that spoke at the March on Washington. And he had the wonderful gift of speaking right before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But a picture of King and Rabbi Prince sit on my wall in my Senate office. And that speech that Johann Prince gave is worthy of knowing some of what he said. Rabbi Prince said very powerfully, bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful and most tragic problem is silence. America must not become a nation of onlookers. Americans must not remain silent. We have an obligation to each other that we must stand up and work for each other's liberations because we are living in an interconnected, intersectional world. As King rightfully said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I am here because of a group like yours. A group of Blacks and whites, Christians and Jews came together in the 1960s in my state to help families, Black families, move into neighborhoods that were being restricted to Black families. Literally, my parents, trying to buy a home, were frustrated, would find beautiful homes with great public schools, neighborhoods with great public schools, and they'd be turned away from those houses and told they were sold, lied to. Well, a group of folks came together, put white couples coming out after my parents. They would find out the house was still for sale. On the house I grew up with, indeed, my parents were told it was sold. The white couple found out it was still for sale. They put a bid on the house. The bid was accepted. Papers were drawn up, and on the day of the closing, the white couple didn't show up. My dad did, and a Jewish lawyer named Marty Friedman showed up. They walked into the real estate agent's office, confronting him on his real estate steering. But before they could get even going on their confrontation, the real estate agent, realizing he'd been caught, didn't give up, stood up and punched Marty in the face and sigged a dog on my dad. Well, I grew up in this amazing community. And I'm telling you, every time my dad would tell that story, the dog would get bigger. Eventually he was, son, I had to fight a pack of wolves to get you in this house. But my parents raised me to understand that we are where we are because of the sacrifices of so many. And in particular, the sacrifices of Jews who were compelled by their moral compass to continue to fight for justice. We have come a mighty long way, but we have a long way to go. Our strength does not lie in our individuality. Our strength really lies in our ability to come together in love for the cause of justice. Thank you all for continuing that noble tradition of Blacks and Jews standing together, not remaining in silence, but lifting every voice and singing a song of freedom. You give me hope that together we shall overcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Booker. So in the spirit of the Arab Jewish Entertainment Alliance, where storytelling and documentaries are going to play a big role, we have a little treat for you today. It's a very short trailer of a new film called Shared Legacies. And it is the story of two communities who joined forces in the struggle for freedom, civil rights, and human dignity. It brings history alive through the memories of the people who actually shaped the Black Jewish Civil Rights Alliance, whose mission continues today. And here's the trailer.
There's an African proverb that says if the lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit.
I'm telling you the story now because you're young lions and lionesses.
My great-grandfather had been in slavery, and it goes across generations. You just don't get rid of it simply because there are no chains on you.
The effects of slavery are still very prominent, just as the effects of the Holocaust are still very prominent amongst our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community.
The Jewish people have the DNA in their soul to look up close to what happened to African Americans after slavery.
We came to the South, young Jews, rabbis, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany. We hear Dr. King quoting the prophets. That was extraordinary. It made us proud.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, "The future of America will depend on how it responds to Dr. King."
It was the work that Dr. King had spoken for, fairness, equality, against anti-Semitism, and for freedom for Soviet Jews.
A large Jewish presence in the civil rights movement was evident almost from the beginning.
Well, Stan Levinson and Harry Wachtel were lawyers who were working with Dr. King. They were advisors, marchers, fundraisers. They were in the thick of things.
Many Jewish students worked all across the South. And I will never, ever forget 3 young men, Andy Goodman, Micah Scherner, and James Shaney.
Birmingham is Birmingham.
We all know the Exodus is the central narrative of our redemption. And here is a modern situation. Shall we do nothing?
We could not have gotten anywhere had not Protestants, Catholics, and Jews showed up from all over the world.
Rabbi Yaakov Prinz spoke immediately before Dr. King.
The most shameful and the most tragic problem is silence.
The civil rights challenges of our time, the human rights challenges of our day, they hang on me. They hang on you. They hang on who? They hang on us.
We all need to get together to find out the bigger picture. Those who have been stepped upon have to lead the way.
It's all about our humanity. And if we don't figure out a way truly to work together, we'll just be like hamsters on a wheel. The systemic oppression and issues will just continue.
There are too many people living in fear. If Rabbi Herscher and Martin Luther King Jr. were here today, I think they would be saying, we need to pull together for a generation yet unborn.
The soul of America is at stake.
That was a wonderful trailer. Now let's start our conversation. Our panel today, Mark Morail, President and CEO of the National Urban League, and Rabbi Mark Schneier, founder and president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. Gentlemen, it's great to have you today. Mark, I think last time I met you, you were in LA. We were doing a joint event together. So it's good you both have the same first name.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to start by looking over, it's been a long, complicated journey between the Blacks and the Jews in America. If we go way back to even the time before slavery, during slavery, the differences between the Jews of the North and the Jews of the South. And then when you had a migration of African Americans from the South to the North that coincided with a huge migration of Jews from Eastern Europe, and how they met in the same neighborhoods. Right. And eventually we had this great civil rights movement, and there seemed to be a real love affair and connection in those days. Then it felt like we might have drifted, since then. And now I'm sensing a kind of a movement to reconnect. How would you characterize this long journey? Both of you. Mark, you can start.
Yeah, I think it's been a long journey of friendship, brotherhood, sisterhood, and also at times tension over issues of policy centered around certain issues. I think affirmative action created some tension in the 1970s in the relationship. But let me tell you why I think today the opportunity for resurgence is so necessary and so evident because of what we've experienced as a country. We've seen this palpable rise in hate-filled violence, in hate crimes, and it's been directed at people who are Jewish. It's been directed at people who are Asian. It's been directed at people who are African American, Latinx, LGBTQ. We've seen this dramatic rise in the last 5 years of hate crimes directed at Americans who some Americans consider to be other Americans. And if anything should bond us together, it is that racial and religious bigotry are both fruits of the same poisonous, despicable tree. Now, having said that, I also find that it is so crucial that we educate, re-educate, and restate the history, right? It is so important for African Americans to understand not only the history of Jews in the United States, but the history of the Jewish diaspora over the last many thousands of years, and for Jews to understand the Middle Passage and beyond in the system of slavery and segregation. What is so evident to me as I reflect in these times on the American history book that I read as a third or fourth grader, and how it talked about American expansion into North America by the settlers having as an intent to Christianize the heathen natives, and that slavery was justified by Christianizing. You saw the abuse, I call it the out and out abuse of religion to divide, to demean, and to disparage people. So Rabbi Mark and I have struck up a friendship. I've worked with a number of other Jewish groups for this conversation and understanding. And we're doing a number of things that are really designed to build build new bridges and build new understanding. And so we always have to have candid conversations, but I prefer to understand the past and focus on the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. In the spirit of understanding the past, Rabbi Schneier, I had an interesting conversation many years ago during one of the dips in the relationship. And I was speaking to a rabbi friend of mine who had a conversation with an African-American friend of his. And the rabbi asked him, what happened? What happened to our relationship? We had such a great love affair in the 60s. And then his African-American friend said, you guys stopped being a minority. I never forgot that answer. What's your take on that, Mark?
Well, first, it's wonderful to see you, David, even though we're thousands of miles apart. To my beloved, distinguished friend, Mark Morial, it's always a great honor. And yes, we both have the same first name, and we even spell it the correct way with a C. In terms of your question, to give you a little background, in 1989, the late Joseph Papp, who was the great Broadway impresario, myself, we established the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. And our exclusive focus was to rebuild, to restore the historic Black-Jewish alliance. As Mark Morial mentioned before, that during the 1950s and 1960s, there was no segment of American society that provided as much and as consistent support to Dr. King and to the African-American community as did the Jewish community. You shared with us this wonderful trailer of the movie Shared Legacies and made reference to the freedom rides of 1963-64, when more than 70% of the college students coming down from the north happened to be Jewish, when the Jewish population was less than 1% of the greater American population, so that the Jewish community made an outsized contribution in terms of the civil rights and fighting for civil liberties and justice, for our Black brothers and sisters. At the same time, which is documented in my book, Shared Dreams, which is very much considered the definitive text in Black-Jewish relations, when I define and I record Dr. King's contribution to the Jewish community. Dr. King was a great advocate for the state of Israel. He was involved in the plight of the Soviet Jewry. He had zero tolerance for anti-Semitism and spoke many times of the Holocaust. In terms of your rabbi's friend comment about being a minority, that really led to the rupture right after Dr. King's assassination. And I think what this gentleman might have meant that we were no longer viewed as a minority in the Middle East, region. You'll find that, as I document in my book, there were many of the leaders of the more Black militant movements after Dr. King's assassination that began to identify with the cause of the Palestinians. And we're talking about the Palestinians back then under the leadership of Yasser Arafat and the really horrific acts of terror that they inflicted upon that they visited upon the state of Israel and Jewish people, so that for many years up to the Six-Day War of '67, Israel, the Jewish people, we were seen as the underdog. We were seen as the minority. Suddenly, after the Six-Day War, not only did Israel celebrate a historic, miraculous victory, but that victory restored the honor and the dignity of the Jewish people, so much so that we were no longer seen as the underdog. We were no longer seen as a minority per se. And I believe that perhaps that was the reference that that gentleman was making in terms of now seeing the Jewish people no longer as the minority, no longer as the underdog, but really as the victor. We were no longer the David. Many people in the Black militant community saw us as the oppressor, as the Goliath.
Oh, great. Mark, I'd like to pick up on that because that's a fascinating insight on connecting what was happening in Israel to what was happening in America. And in many ways, some of those dynamics are still at play. Because 1967 war began this new image of Israel no longer as the underdog. And since then, it's been a country that's been personified by a great deal of success and power. And I wonder if a similar thing was happening here in America, where the Jews were also being personified in a way of success and power. And maybe that was part of
you make a very important distinction. And I think that there's a local dimension to the relationship between Blacks and Jews. So New York City is unto itself, because New York City has a large Jewish community and a large Black community. Many communities in the United States may not have as large a Jewish community in terms of the numerical numbers or the presence in the business community or in other areas. And so when I grew up in New Orleans, it was at the Jewish Community Center where I first learned to swim, because the public pools were closed to African Americans in those days. And my mother was friendly with a woman who was a member of the Jewish Community Center and president of the League of Women Voters. And she just decided one day, she said to my mother, "Sybil, we're going to take your kids and swim there. We're just going to walk in and they're going to get in the pool." And I double dare anybody, she was a tough lady, to tell me anything. It was the Jewish community in New Orleans that was that part of the broader white community that was involved in civil rights. I think that the dimension and the relationship between Blacks and Jews is also local. I think in New York City, there's a lot more of a focus on international affairs and the connectivity between international affairs and relationships between communities that doesn't exist to the same intensity and the same level in a place like New Orleans or Houston or Atlanta. And I think that it is important to recognize that. But the, if you will, Middle East dynamics does have an impact. Now, my point of view, and I've said this, is that anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, that hatred is something I abhor on a universal nature. And I think that we have to build a relationship and not center it around positions on political international affairs. I really think while that's important to some, we're trying to build community here in the United States. And I think by building community in the United States, I could, with respect to a lot of communities, analyze the international posture of Israel or China or Myanmar or Venezuela and or any nation, or Mexico or France, and let that become the central animating purpose or the central animating issue in the relationship. I don't choose to do that, right? Now, those who do, that's you. For me, I'm trying to build community locally. I grew up in New Orleans, and that relationship was important because there was so much in the 60s hostility that our allies who marched and walked and supported and raised money are people I saw in the orbit of my parents, who were frontline civil rights workers, part of their extended friendship and part of their extended relationships. And so I really feel that while an analysis of why is so important, right here at home in the United States today, this rise of racial and religious bigotry is such a threat to the future of democracy and such a threat to the future community. I think it is where our focus should be.
Okay. Rabbi Schneier, in that spirit, because of the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years, I think a lot of this reconnection between the Black and Jewish community has focused on that, a kind of a shared victimhood. And I think that's been pretty well established. Do you see other areas of commonality that we can bond with, especially since you've done so much work in this area?
Well, I would define the relationship that we've had over the last 30 years as being both historical and hysterical. And I think that we need to move away from the hysterics and go back to our history. If there was one principle that Dr. King taught both Blacks and Jews, that a people who fight for their own rights are only as honorable as when they fight for the rights of all people. So it's not a question of really finding a common issue. It's a question of being able to develop an empathetic imagination when it comes to the other. It's about fighting for the other. It's not a quid pro quo. Okay, we're under attack in terms of anti-Semitism. Blacks are under attack in terms of racism. It doesn't have to be such a precise quid pro quo. There are issues. There are existentialist issues that are of concern to the Black community today that we must rally behind, because it's about fighting for the other. As there are issues that are of deep concern to the Jewish community, that we will look to the Black community and Black leadership to support us as well. And that was Dr. King's formula. It was about fighting for the other. The two issues did not have to be equivocal. They did not have to equate. It was really trying to understand. I think it was Walt Whitman who coined the, not coined the phrase, but expressed that in terms of his definition of empathy, that he says that when I read about the wounded person, I put myself, in that person's place as if I am the wounded person. That's the place we need to be. So to me, it's not a question of any specific issues. If the Black community is under duress, if the Black community needs our support, Jewish support, we must be there, no matter what the issue is, as we would, in return, look to the Black communities who support us on a host of litany and a litany of issues as well.
Mark, since this program is from the Black Jewish Entertainment Alliance,
yes,
I want to share something with you because I have a very special place in my heart for comedy. I have a theory that one of the great components of the love affair between Jews and America has been due to these hundreds and hundreds of Jewish comics over the past century that poked fun at themselves and that just shared so much of the value of comedy. When I see these old YouTube videos of Sammy Davis Jr. and some Jewish comics, it just brings a special warmth to my heart, because that is also America. And I wonder, in addition to all these serious things that are so valuable that we're talking about, whether there's a role for comedy here, because God knows there are amazing comics on both sides.
Good comedy is incredibly insightful, political, and a learning tool. When you think of really good comics, really good comics are very smart, observant, and know how to take a situation and give you a message. So I think there's a role for comedy. I also think that, you've got to be also careful with comedy so that you don't, in making people laugh, disparage people also. And I think that the role of comedy is so important. I just saw a special documentary on Sammy Davis Jr. And, I, had mixed views as a young man about Sammy Davis because he had endorsed Nixon And in those days, Nixon was not a popular figure among Black America. But what you learn from Sammy Davis, from the documentary, is how much he was enormously talented in a very special way, and certainly one of America's first Black crossover artists, who had a deep, deep following among white Americans and a deep, deep following among Black Americans. And in that respect, he was extremely, he was unique. And he was, at heart, he was a comic. But you knew him as a singer, you knew him as an actor, you knew him as a dancer. He was enormously, so, it's so important. You talk about humor and you talk about entertainment, how the business of entertainment, and I think in this alliance, I think the real potential benefit of the alliance is also trying to help African Americans advance on the business side of the entertainment business, the money-making side, the behind the camera, behind the stage, producers, directors, technicians and others, the orchestrators and owners, which is why I think the alliance is something that I feel enthusiastic about, because African Americans and Jews have had a very important role, and both communities have sort of over-indexed, if you want to use that term, their role in the whole business of entertainment, right? From being performers to being behind the scenes. And so this is something I have hope for. We're gonna have to work very, very hard to help people realize it. Whenever you do things like this, you've got supporters and you got cynics, and I'm an eternal optimist, and Mark, Rabbi Mark and I have told, I'm always ready to try something, see if we can get some traction, try to bring a few folks together, and not get caught in the paralysis of analysis. And sometimes you talk yourself into inaction because there's no guarantee that anything you try is going to succeed. But points well made by you.
Oh, well, thank you. Rabbi Schneier, there was a major controversy a few weeks ago because an African-American comic on Saturday Night Live made that joke that, went around the world on the vaccines in Israel and saying half of the population got vaccinated. And I assume that half was the Jewish one. I wonder if you think that sometimes we go too far with these kind of condemnations, because I have a piece I'm working on called, can we fight anti-Semitism without losing our sense of humor? And I just wonder, what's your take on that, Rabbi? I mean, we were all kind of taken aback, and obviously there was a wrong stereotype and stuff, but the guy's still a comic. And do you think the reaction was too much?
David, you're preaching to the choir.
Oh.
I think our reaction was so overblown and was so outsized. I mean, you don't try and bring in a nuclear bomb, to crush an ant. I mean, ants, I'm referring to the statement itself. Look, it was really in the spirit of humor. Personally, I thought it was an innocuous remark. Remember, the context of Saturday Night Live. And I find very often, and I've had, I paid my dues, whether it was chairman of the World Jewish Congress or president of the New York Board of Rabbis, in terms of Jewish organizational involvement. And sometimes the Jewish community were so overly sensitive to statements that are made, forgetting that, if you look at the world global population, what's our population now? 16 million. And sometimes I feel that we behave as if the whole world is just preoccupied and focused on the Jewish people. I must tell you, one of my favorite stories, I think both you and Mark will get a kick out of this, that in 2015, after I had written my last book called Sons of Abraham, which is about Muslim-Jewish relations, and President Clinton wrote the foreword to the book. So the president of Indonesia invited me and the Imam Shamsi Ali, who's the head Imam of New York, to do a book tour in Indonesia, in Jakarta, to discuss the whole subject of Muslim-Jewish relations. And when I saw the president, he said, "Rabbi, would you do me a favor? And would you mind traveling 45 minutes to Yogyakarta?" Yogyakarta would be like their Boston, their big college town. "And Rabbi, would you mind addressing 2 large gatherings of university students?" So, we go to Yogyakarta. Forget about them never meeting a rabbi. Let's remember, it's the largest Muslim country in the world. 225 million Muslims in Indonesia. Forget about never meeting a rabbi. They had never met a Jew before. So, of course, I make my presentation. And right after, the first question, Rabbi, please tell us, so how many Jews are there? I said, I don't know, probably around 16 million. And the student says, no, not in New York. and the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes our response, and I feel very, very strongly about this, and I went public about this, that I think sometimes our responses are a bit, we're a bit too hypersensitive. I don't think that, Saturday Night Live, the gentleman who made the comments, it was, again, it's Saturday Night Live, and I think we should, sometimes we need to take a step back and, to be a little more reasonable in the way we respond to things.
I hope some enterprising student one day writes a major thesis on the connection between sense of humor and fighting anti-Semitism, because I believe, my gut tells me that there is, that the more of a sense of humor we show we have, the more we will fight anti-Semitism.
I'm going to say you're spot on, and I also want to echo what Mark said before in terms of this Black Jewish Entertainment Alliance and the fact that there is such an opportunity, such promise here. I just reached out a few weeks ago to Lee Daniels, the director, just directed the movie about Billie Holiday. The fact that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had done a sting operation, against her. But I explained to Lee Daniels, in our correspondence, that there's a very important Black Jewish element to the story. Her famous song, "Strange Fruit," which were depicting, the lynchings in the South at the time. The only record company that would produce and record that song was a Jewish company. And David, you and I could give example after example after example in terms of this alliance of Blacks and Jews in the entertainment world, and particularly at a time when Black comedians and Black entertainers were just launching their careers, and the extraordinary contributions that members of the Jewish community in the entertainment world made, to assist and to support them at the time. And also, "Strange Fruit" was a poem that was actually written by a Jew. So, but again, that's just one example.
Here's something to keep in mind. I think my wife and I were discussing this this morning about changing social mores, acceptance versus sensitivity to humor, disparagement. It's really, not predictable. How would I say it? That mores are changing in the country. And when we have this, and look, let's just be frank and honest. The presence of the 45th president of the United States spiked up an environment of hate crimes and an acceptance of religious and racial bigotry, right, that changed the dynamics of communities. We went to a briefing at NYPD about 2 years ago, and the briefing was on hate crimes. And I was literally, I wasn't surprised, but I said, wow, the anti-Semitic hate crimes in New York City had like spiked up in a 2 to 3 year period. Obviously Black and Hispanic and LGBT and now Asian has spiked up at sort of historic levels, in the nation and in the country. And, you say, well, what is the causation? What's the environment that creates this? And I think when this happens, people are much more on edge, because what they see today, we turn on our news here in the New York area, and we see Asian Americans. Well, it's not just hate speech, it's hate speech and violence, people being punched in the nose, people being knocked down. And I think that raises people's sensitivity levels as to whether things that may seem humorous, in fact, are normalizing the acceptability of racially and things that are racially disparaging and disparaging from a religious basis. I think it's important for us to recognize, and as leaders, to understand these changing tolerance levels, in the country. And I think today, with what we see, it's certainly unacceptable. It's not tolerable. It makes me cringe. And then I'm like, I don't want to do anything to encourage it, suggest it, or suggest that it's acceptable. And sometimes that means, well, something that, hey, might be humorous to me might be disparaging to somebody else. And, sometimes it's not the way something is intended, it's the way it's received. And that's why humor is a powerful weapon and a powerful power. It also can be taken out of context and misunderstood very easily.
Well, thank you for that. I have some questions from the audience. The first one is a very sensitive issue that I was going to bring up, but the question handles it for me. Louis Farrakhan has made many troubling anti-Semitic statements over the years, but he's also beloved in large parts of the Black community for the social work the Nation of Islam does. How do we get the Black community to call out, to condemn the message without having them have to command the messenger?
I can only speak for myself, and I will condemn the message, but I'm very, very reluctant to condemn messengers, so that it's clearly understood that, and I think this is the important thing. Let's separate, or not separate, let's think of the Nation of Islam as a historic religious denomination that played a very important role in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in helping Black men who were incarcerated reconnect to society. And so there's a little bit of a legacy in terms of the organization, but I don't sanction, support hate speech, period. I don't care if it comes from a Black person, a white person, a Jewish person, a Muslim person. I just don't think that you have to have a position that hatred, is indivisible. But I also think that it's also important to recognize that Minister Farrakhan is a voice in the Black community. But there are many other voices in the Black community. There are many other Muslim voices in the Black community, Christian ministers in the Black community, secular leaders in the Black community, right? And so while you have to understand his influence, right, to suggest that he is a dominant influence in the community, we do not have a dominant leader in the same way we may have had in the 1960s when Martin King was quite prominent and Malcolm X was prominent. We have a different framing now, right? We have elected officials, we have civil rights leaders, we have business leaders who are all important voices. And like any other group, all Black people don't agree, right? All Black people do not agree. Simply because they might not openly speak out should never be understood as an assent to anything that's anti-Semitic. So it's repulsive to me, whether it's Minister Farrakhan who says things that are anti-Semitic or anyone else that says things that are anti-Semitic. But I'm not running around as a speech police to condemn him or anyone else. I want to be understood as a leader of a civil rights organization for what I believe, for what I think, and for what our point of view is.
David, if I can add to that, I once had this very frank exchange with the late Coretta Scott King. It was 1995. It was really at the height of Louis Farrakhan's influence. And Coretta had come to New York as my guest on Martin Luther King Day. We did a very, intensive and very expansive Black Jewish event. And in a private moment, I said to Mrs. King, I said, could you please explain to me, why aren't Black leaders coming out and condemning Louis Farrakhan? And she said, Mark, that would go against Martin's teachings. I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, Martin's teachings follow the teachings of Jesus. And that moment was an epiphany for me, because at the end of the day, as Marc Morial just delineated between the message and the messenger, we don't have that delineation in Judaism. You have two belief systems that are in conflict here. In Christianity, you condemn the message, but not the messenger. In Judaism, we go right after the messenger. And I think that people and the audience that are viewing this webinar in particularly need to understand that this is more of a theological conflict. You have Christianity and Judaism that preach a very different and distinctive doctrine as to when it comes to condemnation. Again, in Judaism, we condemn both the message and the messenger. In Christianity, one condemns the message, but not the messenger.
Wonderful. Here's another question for both of you. Since the Jews have figured out, or we think we figured out, how to make it in America, despite all the challenges of things like institutional racism, how can Jews best support reparations and other efforts towards helping America achieve its goal of being a more just and equal society? Marc Morial, do you want to go first?
I think it's so important that people in the Jewish community work to create great understanding in the Jewish community. On reparations certainly means to repair. And some people see reparations as only mean, quote, a cash payment. I prefer to understand it much more broadly, that it means systemic change. Change is with respect to, when we talk about equitable change, we want to change the economic and the educational system so that it produces more equal outcomes. And that takes a tremendous amount of work. And we need, Black people in America, and the Black struggle has always been centrally led by Black people fighting for their own freedom, but it has always involved important allies, all the way back to the 1780s, when the abolitionists in places like Pennsylvania took a moral stand. The Quakers took a moral stand against slavery and made Pennsylvania sort of an anti-slavery state. It has to be understood that those alliances, and I think building strong alliances with the Jewish community is so important, because the Jewish community has withstood and experienced one of a modern experience and an attempt at mass genocide, which is what the Holocaust is all about. That's less than 100 years ago. Less than 100 years ago. Now, for African Americans, you know, the quote unquote system of slavery and segregation and not genocide has happened over a long arc, you know, of hundreds of years. But that's not the point. The point is, I think that the Jewish community, having faced that type of physical systemic oppression, may best understand in the context of the United States why we need systemic change, not just charity. We need institutional change, not just token policies. And I think that fundamental understanding, you know, I believe that understanding the history, and one of my great interests is in helping younger people, and maybe this is more work we could do, young Jews, young African Americans, understand the shared history of oppression and the recognition. I've always been someone who loved the ritual, the fact that the Passover is celebrated, and to understand what it really, really means. And no one says, forget the Passover. So that's why I said, no one should say to Black people, forget slavery, because it is important to celebrate and respect the power that people had to overcome the effort to annihilate and eliminate them. Whether it was then, whether it was the Holocaust, whether it's slavery, whether it's the system of segregation or institutional racism. And so I think that's where we have this unique ability to bond, that and I had an opportunity to go to the museum in Jerusalem with my wife and I 20 years ago. And I said to her, I said, you see, this is the experience that Americans need to have, right? Just like it's important to go to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., because we have to recognize, I think it's true, we've been miseducated about a number of these things. We've been miseducated about the weight of officialized genocide and oppression, but also we have to recognize how much power and resilience our forefathers and foremothers in the Black community and the Jewish community had to overcome those differences and those distinctions, and to make great contributions to the United States. And so that's what I firmly believe, which is why I think people in the Jewish community may instinctively have a better sense, or should have a better sense, I might say, of institutionalized barriers beyond individualized bigotry or individualized racism.
Well, Mark, you said something interesting, that you love rituals. So you got to promise me that next time you're in LA, you will join us at our Friday night Shabbat table.
Yes, I will. And
There's
I've done that in the past at Temple Sinai in New Orleans, where I have many friends. Yeah, I will do that.
Wonderful. Rabbi Schneier, as I was listening to Mark speak, I had a thought for the first time when he mentioned the idea of reparation, that it's not just a check, it's the idea of repair, right? And it struck me for the first time that the word reparations connects with perhaps the most prominent word of the Jewish tradition in modern day America, which is to repair the world.
Yeah, but I want to this question that you posed. It's one of my favorite topics. And I applaud, Mark's response and tying this into Passover. But I'm going to take this conversation in a very different direction right now. It's one of my most favorite op-eds I ever wrote, very popular. In fact, it was published in the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles long before there was a David Suissa affiliated with that paper. And I appreciate what Mark said in terms of our shared experience of oppression and slavery. But I think, and particularly before Passover, which is now in 3.5 weeks, that Jews need to be much more sensitive to the plight of Black Americans because of the post-slavery experience. Let's just quickly examine, the Jewish experience in Egypt. We were in bondage for 210 years. God uses Moses to deliver the people. We're literally put into quarantine for 40 years, so much so that not a single member of the slave generation was able to enter the promised land. Now think about the post-slavery experience here in the United States. All right, Blacks are now freed and they are told to rebuild their lives within the very same neighborhoods, within the very same locales as the people that had enslaved them, within the very same regions of the people who were their taskmasters. Imagine if the Jewish people had to undergo that kind of challenge. I don't know if we would have made it out of Egypt, if we would have had the capacity and the ability to reemerge and to rebuild our lives. If anything, on the part of the Jewish community, on the part of all ethnic communities, particularly white America, there needs to be a great appreciation and acknowledgement as to how the Black community literally rebuilt their lives and were able to emerge into such a prominent part of American society when they had to rebuild their lives in the very same conditions and in the very same neighborhoods and cities and towns of the people that had enslaved them. When you have that sensitivity, when you can express that empathy for the Black plight in America, then maybe you'd have a greater appreciation as to the importance of restitution, whether it's moral restitution, whether it's monetary restitution. But let's also acknowledge and let's applaud this great achievement on the part of the Black community of rebuilding their lives among the very people that had enslaved them.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I have good news for all of us. The organizers of this event have allowed us to go over the time. So for me, it's good news for me because I'm loving this conversation. So because we're already over and we can go over 10, 15 minutes. Mark Morile, I want to pick up on something that the rabbi just spoke about. Do you ever get a sense that in the spirit of today, when there is so much talk of systemic racism and how deep the problems are and so forth, that somehow it gets lost in the picture that a tremendous amount of progress has been made in the past 50 years? Do you find that that progress gets lost?
I think what's happened, to be quite honest with you, is I think the mindset of many at the beginning of the 21st century was that progress had been made and that all we need to do is continue to make progress. And we would be closer to the goal of equality. Then the recession came. And the recession coincided with the election of Obama. So on one hand, there was great hope, but there was great ground lost. Black people lost 8 to 10% of their home ownership. African American wages became depressed and unemployment spiked. And then there was this bit of a comeback. And then all of a sudden, you had the age of Trump and all that went along with that, and now COVID. So the data shows that while there was important progress from 64 to 2003 or 4, that on many objective standards, particularly when so far as economics is concerned, ground has been lost. And I also think seminal for African Americans was the 2013 decision of the Supreme Court striking down important provisions of the Voting Rights Act, with the Supreme Court sort of suggesting that because Barack Obama was elected, there was no more quote unquote race issue in American politics, which was a naive proposition. So it's important to understand that we have to always celebrate the progress that we've made since 1954, 1964. But to understand, there's a sense, and I think it's borne out by the numbers and borne out by the experiences, that there's now an assault on that progress. 43 states have now introduced legislation to initiate voter suppression laws, end early voting, end mail voting, require 2 forms of ID when you vote, just an out and out, if you will, assault. So everything is in context.
If I can,
so while we made progress, the experiences of recent point to really a pushback of tremendous, and so much of it is associated with the Trumpism,
okay,
and the Trump motif, and the Trump approach, and the Trump philosophy.
If I can pick up on that, there seems to be 2 schools of thought. One school of thought is more the Martin Luther King school of thought, which is that, you know, he came to cash a check, that the mechanisms of repair was built in to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And based on that, that's how he fought for justice. Whereas now there seems to be a movement, one of them is called the 1619 Project, that, you know, redefines American history as going back to the date when the first ship of slaves came to America. And it seems to go in a different direction than the direction of Martin Luther King, which says we have the system in place with the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution. We can use, these are the tools that we can use to gain justice. Where do you stand on
Well,
this?
let me say this. I think Martin Luther King was right for his times. And at his death, he was about to initiate a new movement for economic justice. He had evolved in a significant way. So I don't think we got a complete opportunity to see what would have been next. And I believe that Dr. King positioned his movement and brilliantly synthesized the teachings of Christianity with the principles of the Constitution to build a movement that broad numbers of Americans could embrace. But I do believe that the 1619 Project is important because I continue to believe that one of our challenges in America is not knowing and understanding history. My wife's a journalist. She's been doing some research. She's done some stories on Tulsa. And what she uncovered in her research is the hundreds of, if you will, like Tulsa acts of violence, which took place in the early 20th century, directed at African Americans that were never really covered, that to some extent were suppressed. So we got to keep a balance that Dr. King was right for his times, but we did not know where Dr. King was going with his Poor People's March. He began to think more broadly, not beyond race, but understanding race as a broader component of the economic structure of America.
And in many ways, the election of Joe Biden is a testament to the fact that we still have a mechanism
Joe Biden was perfect for these times because Joe Biden was a personality and a person and a political figure who had this ability to attract a broad coalition. And it is what was necessary. And I tell lots of friends of mine, you can, pick over 1,000 policy positions. But in truth and in fact, to lead this nation today effectively, and it's not an easy thing to do because we're a very complex country. You've got to have a broad enough appeal to hold on to a coalition of people that are going to trust you, even when they may not agree with every single move you make.
Amen to that.
And Joe Biden is also the ultimate testament to the Black-Jewish Alliance and the Black-Jewish Coalition. Let's remember that 82% of African Americans that voted supported Biden, and close to 80% of the Jewish community that voted supported Biden.
Wow.
So you say, Mark, your reaction is exactly why these webinars need to take place. Here you have probably one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished leader of the African-American Black community that had no idea that the Jewish community supported Joe Biden to such
I didn't know the number. I thought it was in the 60s, but it's good to know it's in the 80s. And I think
No, I said close to 80%.
Close to 80.
Yeah, close.
And so it's important that, I tell people that Joe Biden had this varied coalition. He had pieces and parts and in some case majorities of multiple communities in America. And, I think that is what the future will require. I think the future is going to require this unique ability to coalition build. I think it's going to require a unique ability to appeal to multiple communities. American national politics has become like city politics. I cut my teeth in urban politics, leading a city with multiple constituencies. New Orleans sometimes feels like a little New York, or a little Chicago, in how varied it is and how many constituencies there are. And it isn't easy to lead, but it is so affirming when you can bring people together to accomplish big things, whether it's a stronger economy, whether it's safer communities, whether it's to address the challenges of housing or poverty, right? It is an affirming thing when you can build those types of coalitions. And, that's my hope that Joe Biden's going to have the ability to continue to do that. And I don't agree with 100% with any politician, period. I tell people that all the time. If I sat there with a checklist all the time, I'd probably cancel myself out and say, well, none of the above, but that's just not practical reality.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, and I have two questions that I would love to get in. So in the first question, if you can respond as quickly as possible, there are a number of Black Jews and Jews of color who are too often left out of the conversation of Black-Jewish solidarity and the intersection of our efforts to fight racism, anti-Semitism, and bigotry. What is being done or can be done to amplify their important voices?
Well, that process is now taking place. It will take some time. This was not a focus of conversation within the American Jewish community. It's becoming a greater focus today. Need I remind you, it took 40 years to get to the promised land. I'm not going to represent. We're at the promised land of recognizing the significant contribution of Black Jews and Jews of color. But the good news is that the journey has begun and we're hitting the right benchmarks. It's a process, but it's moving in the right direction.
And finally, question for both of you. What is one book or movie you recommend people watching or should read or watch or learn more about your community and the struggles you face? Mark Morale?
So I think Just Mercy, is a great movie, but I'd love people to read my book. My book is The Gumbo Coalition. at which I talk about cross-cultural, multiracial leadership and my experiences both in New Orleans and here at the National Urban League. So it's the Gumbo Coalition. So I'm going to plug my own book. I've got about 5 books on my night table that I'm reading simultaneously, including a book on immigration reform, a book on Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. But I like Just Mercy. I like the movie Selma. I think these are important, compelling stories for people to understand these sort of important points in American history.
Rabbi Schneier, besides the Jewish Journal, what books and films would you recommend to
Well,
our
David, you gotta get.
I'm gonna
Mark,
follow,
you gotta give David a good hard plug here now.
listen, I'm going to follow the footsteps of my friend Mark Morial. I'm going to plug my 2 books, Dreams, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Jewish Community, and also The Sons of Abraham, and the film that I produced 2 years ago called Jinn, that won one of the top awards at the Southwest Film Festival in Austin. It's the first film that I produced about growing up, a teenager growing up as an Islamic teenager in the United States, because whether it's the 2 books and the film, it really touches upon this very unique role. And as it's said in the movie Shared Legacies, the DNA of the Jewish people, that we are always the first in line when it comes to fighting for others, when it comes to supporting. I mean, if you speak to American Muslim leaders today, they will tell you their greatest friends in the Jewish community, particularly during the years that Trump was president, their greatest friends and supporters were the American Jewish community and its leadership. And that's really what the American Jewish community is all about. The fact that we recognize the role, the historic role, our tradition of always helping those who are in need and trying to elevate and creating a much better world for all of us.
Well, on that note, I just want to close on a personal note. A couple of months ago, I did a podcast precisely to honor the beginning of this new initiative, the Black Jewish Entertainment Alliance. It was a podcast with Ben Silverman, and we spoke about the vision of the organization going forward. And one of the things we discussed was to have these kind of important conversations and webinars that can really deepen the conversation and the connection between our groups. And I think what we've done today is a really good step in that direction. I want to thank both of you for being active participants in this. And I want to thank everybody who listened, who came in on it. And I'm looking forward to more of these kind of events. And Mark, next time you're in LA, and you too, Rabbi Schneier.
We'll see you. We'll come check you out.
And happy Passover.
Oh, and one last thing. Mark Morial, I want to thank you for giving me the topic of my sermon. I love the paralysis of analysis. All right, go home, write my sermon right now.
We want to publish it in the Jewish Journal.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, good to David and Mark, thank you very much.
God
bless you. God bless you.
Take care. Bye-bye.